but he has been doing the rounds on everything from the Late Show with Stephen Colbert to yesterday, Fareed Zakaria, in which he did a very interesting video and very interesting episode I want to talk about. But what's more important and more revealing to me is Thomas just recently did a speech at Notre Dame. Now, remember, Breyer was actually the first when he started this speaking tour to come out. And the headlines were not about his book, the headlines were about his dissent to the court not taking up the case in Texas that effectively made abortions illegal in Texas with this very nuanced, this very, in I think a lot of people's opinion, very dangerous law that basically puts a bounty on people who try to help someone get an abortion. And the headlines were about how dangerous the court was and how dangerous and how much of a dissent that he had in this decision. So then I don't believe coincidentally, Amy Coney Barrett goes to the McConnell Center, where, and we talked about this on last week's episode, where she goes out and basically starts becoming very concerned about the perception of the court, right? Mitch McConnell introduces her, right? Mitch McConnell, the most partisan justice, the most partisan senator in all of in all of the Senate. He comes out and introduces her, and she makes the statement that everybody sort of quotes, all the news media quotes, and that is, I'm trying to convince you I'm not a partisan hack, right? That's the concern that she has. Then we have this week, right? That was actually not last week, the week before last, right? Our last podcast, the week before last, she does this statement. Then last week, which would have been on Friday, Thomas does this speech, and this one is recorded. Amy Coney Barrett wasn't recorded, so all we had was for evidence was the reporters who were put in the back of the room to report this, right? They couldn't bring any cameras. They couldn't video it. I think there was one photographer who took a picture, so one picture could come out of this. So they wanted the media to get a hold of this, but there was no back and forth questions. It was just a speech. Then we have Thomas, who is actually giving an announcement, a speech at Notre Dame, where he is talking about his life history and everything. And what I find striking, again, this man is a justice, right? We're going to talk about how Breyer views the court, but basically one of the things he says is that the court gets its legitimacy not because it can do anything, but because people have faith in the court, and that these people are above reproach. That's why they have lifetime tenure, right? The idea was that you don't want to be able to offer them anything that would be tempting, like be able to, say, be able to bribe them or anything like that. The idea of the lifetime tenure was supposed to be to sort of insulate these folks from being, being able to be manipulated. Good luck. The founders thought about that. But he almost begins early on, and I'm going to play clips from that. He almost begins early on. C-SPAN carried it, I guess, alive, talking about just like Trump, just like Q, just like the Republican Party, he takes a pot shot at the media, which I think I found fascinating, because this is not something that you would expect someone who's supposed to be above the fray, who is supposed to be above politics, is to take a shot at the media. But this is a guy, Clarence Thomas. He's been on there longer than anybody else. He had a bruising confirmation because he was being replaced, just like Amy Coney Barrett was replaced by one of the most pivotal liberal judges, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He replaced, which I did not remember. I could have swore Bill Clinton had replaced Thurgood Marshall, but apparently not, because Clarence Thomas replaced Thurgood Marshall, one of the liberal lions, one of the most storied judges, black judges. Of course, they wanted to, just like they did with Amy Coney Barrett, a woman with a woman, African American with an African American. So that was the game that Republicans play with all of this. And of course, all of these justices are in the complete opposite spectrum, judicially and ideologically. than their predecessors, than the people that they replaced, right? So that's the game that Republicans play. See, we gave you a woman, we gave you a black person, but, they happen to think like us. Um, so he takes this shot at the media, which you'll hear in a minute. And then he's not talking about, by the way, about all media, right? He's not talking about Fox News or probably OAN. He is talking about the mainstream media, which the mainstream media has a lot of problems, and that they are not perfect, and I would totally agree with it. But again, he's supposed to be a justice. He's supposed to be a guy who is above politics, who is above these kinds of things. And he is trying to do this same game as Amy Coney Barrett. That I'm not a political hack. I'm not somebody who's here just to get rulings and just to rule in the way that I want to see come out. The problem that Thomas has is that he has a huge history behind him, right? Like I just said, the oldest justice, been on the court for longer than anybody. He has a whole lot of history behind him and of what he's said. So I want to play this, and then I'm going to talk about it on the other side, because there are other couple of frustrations that I have regarding Thomas. But yeah.
From time to time, Justice Scalia and I talked about how similar we were, yet so different. We tended to independently arrive at the same conclusion in so many cases. Yet, he was from an educated family in the urban Northeast, while I was from an uneducated family from the Deep South. Of course, the condescending media elites accused me of being his flunky, which bothered him much more than it bothered me. I was used to bigotry. Unlike him, I was used to bigotry, paternalism, and condescension. He was not. After Justice Scalia died, I mentioned our conversation to one of his sons, Father Paul Scalia. He immediately attributed our shared judicial approach to our formation. We were both Catholics, attended parochial schools, and despite the geographic separation, benefited from a common culture. This may seem somewhat anachronistic today, when so many of our common bonds had been severed. The differences are now much more pronounced, since they are no longer ameliorated or temporized by what we all have in common. In my youth, we believed in our country's aspirational motto, E pluribus unum, despite the reality of unequal treatment. In this postmodern, multicultural world, the emphasis is decidedly on the pluribus and not the unum. So much of my thinking about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is influenced by this formation and the world of my youth. Much the same can be said for the Declaration itself. I'm a product of the state of Georgia, the Georgia of the 1950s and 60s. The world where I grew up was quite different from the world of today. That is obvious and borders on a truism. In the race-obsessed world of today, one would think that, or could think, that I'm talking about or referring solely to race. But alas, I'm not. I mean much more than that. In those days of the 1950s, there was, of course, quotidian and pervasive segregation and race-based laws, which were repulsive and at odds with the principles of our country. It was a world of the solid South, when the Democrats were routinely referred to as Dixiecrats. But despite that, there was a deep and abiding love for our country and a firm desire to have the rights and responsibilities of full citizenship. Regardless how society treated us, there was never any doubt that we were equally entitled to claim the promise of America as our birthright, and equally duty-bound to honor and defend her to the best of our ability. We held these ideals first and foremost because we were raised to know that, as children of God, we were inherently equal and equally responsible for our actions. This accepted truth reinforced our proper roles as equal citizens, not the perversely distorted and reduced role offered us by Jim Crow, a role that is not unlike the reduced but apparently more palatable image of blacks that is bandied about or assigned to us today. Whether deemed inferior by the crudest bigots or considered a victim by the most educated elites, being dismissed as anything other than inherently equal is still at bottom a reduction of our human worth. My nuns at St. Benedict's taught me that that was a lie.
Well, okay.
And
Shall we begin? Our first question was from David Green. What, if any, threats do you foresee to the autonomy of the judicial system in the United States over the next 10 to 20 years?
I think one of the difficulties that you all are going to have to deal with is judges going beyond what Article 3 requires and staying within the limitations on judges. There's always a temptation, I think, to go beyond. We see it with the development of substantive due process. Justice Scalia railed about it. And I think that when we do that and we begin to venture into the legislative or executive branch lanes and resolving things that are better left to those branches where people actually have some input and some opportunity to participate in the electoral process as to who those leaders are. Those of us, particularly in the federal judiciary with lifetime appointments, are asking for trouble. I think a lot of the pressure on the nomination and selection process is because of that. I think the court was thought to be the least dangerous branch, and we may have become the most dangerous. And I think that's problematic, and hence the craziness during my confirmation was one of the results of that. It was absolutely about abortion, a matter I had not thought deeply about at the time. But I think a lot of it's our own doing. And I think the threats are we have lost the capacity, even I think as leaders, to not allow others to manipulate our institutions when we don't get the outcomes that we like. When, for example, President Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, there was enough sense of what the court meant and what separation of powers meant to criticize him. Today, you see almost no criticism or very little when you have those kinds of conversations. So I think part of it's the judge's own doing by venturing in the areas we should not have ventured into.
Oh my God, so much there to talk about. That last part is what got a lot of press. The last part of this, I'm going to talk about the first part of that because it is specifically geared towards how many times this guy say elites, right? This idea that the media is elites. Like, are you serious? You mean to tell me you're not a part of the elites? You're a Supreme Court justice. You don't go to those fine dinners. You don't go and rub elbows with the Federalist Society and the rich folks who fund the Federalist Society, like the Koch brothers, the Mercers, and the rest of them. I mean, you all of a sudden have a problem with elites. Your whole career has been about appeasing elites. I want to talk about packing the court in a minute because I find it fascinating that is the thing that he brings up that's on his mind immediately about overreach and about where we're talking about and how things can go wrong with the court is the packing of the courts. There's a bigger case that is you would think would be more important to Thomas right now than packing the courts, his concern about packing the courts. And by the way, he's wrong. It's not about the judges are the problem. It is that the politicians are the problem. His group's politicians. But I want to go back first. Again, the condescending media, the elites, and he says I was more familiar to bigotry and paternalism than Scalia. He is, again, all of that is the media, all of that is the Democrats, all of that is organizations that have tried for years to fight against white racism and against, the NAACP, Al Sharpton, all of these groups. That's who he's talking about. These groups who have been fighting against conservatism, which he believes so much in, states' rights, which he believes so much in. He is criticizing them, calling them the bigots, calling them the elites, right? The folks who are fighting to help each other, to help African Americans get the right to vote, for instance, or the right to women, the right to choose. Like he says, it was my confirmation was all about abortion, something I never even thought about. Are you serious? The guy just went on fire. That this clip is much shorter than what it actually was. As you can see, there are edits. But I mean, the guy begins his whole speech talking about his time with nuns and Jesuit nuns. You mean to tell me during your entire time growing up and going to Catholic school, you never heard about abortion? You never thought about it? And it never occurred to me, abortion. Nothing, something I had never really even thought about. Come on, give me a break. I mean, this is the kind of, it's almost so insulting. It's condescending to some extent. They really expect, and I guess these people are eating it up at Notre Dame. Certainly, those on the right need talking points to talk about. But if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you. Catholics are almost completely obsessed with abortion. I mean, the whole abortion rights movement is all about a Catholic movement. I mean, we usually talk about the Southern Baptists and those, but the Catholics are, right now, the Pope is having to deal with this because they want to not allow Joe Biden to get communion because of his position on abortion. And Catholics are trying to pressure cardinals and whatnot to allow him to have a communion. And the Pope had to speak on this and talk about let's not bring politics into this. So, come on. The race obsessed world of today. And then he starts talking about the race obsessed world. He never really thought about it, but the world is race obsessed today. Um, One of the things that I do agree with is, and I think that a lot of people today, especially a lot of black people today, don't really appreciate that the African Americans, the blacks, I think even going back to slavery, had more of a love for this country than African Americans of today do, which is I find fascinating and ironic. Because when you look at what blacks have done for this country and how they've fought, how they've endured, how they've contributed, how they have historically constantly come back to try and make it in this country and try to make this country great. We fought in every revolution, every war that this country ever fought, we fought, including the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Blacks have, and they had a love for this country. Frederick Douglass had a love for this country, and we were working, and African Americans traditionally, Martin Luther King as well, were working tirelessly. Medgar Evers tirelessly to have this country live up to the promise that liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the promises that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, those promises, tirelessly working for them. So they had a love and respect for this country and a love for this country that I don't think that really African Americans have or really appreciate today. So I totally agree with him with respect to that. But he talks about the reduced role of blacks by Jim Crow, and he says it's not unlike today, which is stunning to me. Um, and this is how you can get a black man who can be put in the highest positions by white folks, by conservatives, by, in this case, Republicans, Republican I think George Bush the first is the one who nominated him to the court. We can thank him for Clarence Thomas. This is how you can get, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, that, oh, it's not political. This is about jurisprudence. And you would sit back and think about how can you have a black man who is traditionally black people have been victims of racism. How can you have somebody think and want to defend the racist system that's going on? Well, here's how. Justice Thomas, he tells us how. Because he doesn't see any difference between, or he sees very little difference between the way blacks are looked at today versus the blacks during Jim Crow. The same reduced role for blacks he talks about. What is he talking about? What is he saying here? What is his point here? The elitist in the media. What is it? Is it that blacks haven't worked hard enough, or is it that the media or the Democratic Party or liberals are trying to prevent blacks by supporting their fight for equal rights, by supporting their fight for the right to vote, the right to have a good job, things like affirmative action and that stuff, years integrating the schools. What is that all about? And it also becomes clear to me in this statement that this is a man, again, who grew up in the South, who grew up in the Jim Crow South. And he clearly understood that there was racism then. But once Jim Crow was gone, the racism was gone in his mind from this description, right? I had a debate one time with one of my conservative callers, and I kept trying to ask him, when did racism end, right? We all know, and he even agreed, that racism did exist in this country at a certain point in time, that it was a factor in this country. He could concede that. But then when did it end, right? If it doesn't exist anymore, when did it end? Could not come up with a time and a date. But I think Thomas makes it very clear. He considers racism Jim Crow. That's what's racism to him, is Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is gone, so racism is gone. Right? So the stuff that we're fighting for, like the right to vote, the right to get a decent job, to be able to have enough money to provide for our family, to be able to live wherever we want, to be able to travel, all of this stuff that have been fought since the civil rights era going forward, that was then summarily dismantled by conservatives. All of this stuff is not racism in his mind, right? Redlining, not racism. Redistricting, which we'll talk about later, not racism. Trying to have the better outcome that supports imprisoning people for voting wrongly, or for voting, in a way that you don't think that you should be able to vote, to tailor make laws, voting laws, so that you provide tricks and traps for blacks so that they can get caught up and have to be imprisoned in certain states. That's not racism. Cops stopping a person and beating them to death. That's not racism. Shooting them. That's not racism. His view in his mind is racism was Jim Crow. We ended Jim Crow. Racism doesn't exist. So what you're hearing from the elites in the media is all an attempt in his mind to, what does he call it? Have the reduced role for blacks, to reduce the role of blacks in our society. Like they can't make victims. That was the thing he considered it. That blacks are considered a victim. Right? Anytime you bring these up, it's victim mentality. It's victim. There is such a thing as victim mentality, and there is a phenomena that is there, but it is not what Justice Thomas is talking about. Finally, because I want to get over to Breyer, but this was incredible. I could spend a whole lot of time continuing to dissect this man and his speech. I bet you that audience was mostly white, probably a lot conservative. But it's important to hear these guys speak, because it is important to understand where they're coming from and what's going on here. Finally, he talks about packing the court in Roosevelt. Not surprised that that's what this is about, because that's what it's about across the board, in my view. This is two things that are happening. They're going to begin to dismantle the administrative state and pass a whole lot of unpopular laws that liberals have been fighting for. Voting rights, the VRA, as well as women's, abortion rights. They're going to go after workers' rights, LGBTQ and marriage equality rights. All of that stuff is on the table now. And he's laying the groundwork, not only to make it okay and to say this isn't politics, this is just we're the judges and this is how we firmly believe and all that kind of stuff. Not mentioning you've got guys, political actors on the court right now who were firmly involved in Bush v. Gore, who were, activists, on the ground activists like Kavanaugh and Roberts, I believe, was in the court. No, he wasn't. Well, I think he was in the court and heard one of the cases or something like that. But Roberts had a role in that time. These guys were not, in law school or teaching somewhere or something like that. They were actively creating policy and actively working as agents for the Republican Party. Right? So Thomas talks about packing the court. They're concerned also with a court that comes out later on and upends precedent, right? He's talking about not the justices of today, but justices that may come in the future. And he knows that Biden, with Democrats in both the House and the Senate, could pass a law to begin packing the court. And he's afraid that a new court would come in and begin to undo all the damage that they're beginning to do right now. But to talk about the hypocrisy of Clarence Thomas, this is a guy who just now talked about precedent and judges not overstepping their bounds, sort of judicial restraint. But this was the Clarence Thomas of not that long ago. Urged the Supreme Court to feel free to reverse precedent. This was June 17th, 2019, right? That's only, 2 years ago? Here it is. It says, Justice Clarence Thomas on Monday urged the U.S. Supreme Court to feel less bound up by upholding precedent, advancing a view that if adopted by enough of his fellow justices, it would result in more past decisions being overruled, perhaps including the landmark Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion nationwide. Writing in a gun possession case over whether the federal government and states can prosecute someone separately for the same crime, Thomas said that the court, right? So this is saying he wrote a dissent in a case about gun possession, about overturning all laws. I mean, it wasn't even, what was it? This was a case, can someone be charged separately for the same crime? So he writes a dissent that has absolutely nothing to do with the case, but he wants to get this out there, right? This is how radical this thinking is. He wants to get out there this idea that we need to start working now to begin. And by this time, by the way, Gorsuch is on the court, so we're still 5-4, and Kavanaugh is on the court. Writing in a separate gun possession case over whether the federal government and states can prosecute someone separately for the same crime, Thomas said the court should reconsider its standard for reviewing precedent. Thomas said that the 9 justices should not uphold precedents that are demonstrably erroneous, regardless of whether other factors supporting letting them stand. When faced with a demonstrably erroneous precedent, my rule is simple. We should not follow it, wrote Thomas, who has long expressed a great willingness than his colleagues to overturn precedent. In a concurring opinion which no other justice joined, Thomas referred to the court's 1992 decision on Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which reaffirmed Roe and said states cannot place an undue burden on the constitutional rights of an abortion recognized in the Roe decision. Thomas, a member of the court at the time, dissented in the Casey ruling. Thomas, 70, joined the court in 91 and was appointed by George H.W. Bush. The court now has a 5-4 conservative majority, and Thomas is among the most conservative He demonstrated his willingness to abandon precedent in February when he wrote that the court should consider its landmark 64 New York Times versus Sullivan ruling that made it harder for public officials to win libel lawsuits. Thomas says legal questions have objectively correct answers, and judges should find them regardless of whether their colleagues or predecessors found different answers. Everyone is concerned about this because they're thinking about Roe versus Wade. So, I mean, talk about a 180. 2019, we should overturn precedent. If we find it in our conservative minds that these were wrongly decided, let's not hold on to precedent. Let's not confine ourselves to holding on to these old rulings that are clearly wrong in our minds. Let's overrun them. Let's overdo them. Let's decide differently, right? And today, or a couple of days ago, he's talking about the judges. We need to be much more moderate. I want to play that one more time. That video, that end port.
From time to time, Justice Scalia and I talked about how similar we're doing, and I think the threats are we have lost the capacity, even I think as leaders, to not allow others to manipulate our institutions when we don't get the outcomes that we like. When, for example, President Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, there was enough sense of what the court meant and what separation of powers meant to criticize him. Today, you see almost no criticism or very little when you have those kinds of conversations. So I think judges going beyond what Article 3 requires and staying within the limitations on judges. There's always a temptation, I think, to go beyond. We see it with the development of substantive due process. Justice Scalia railed about it. And I think that when we do that and we begin to venture into the legislative or executive branch lanes and resolving things that are better left to those branches where people actually have some input and some opportunity to participate in the electoral processes to who those leaders are. Those of us, particularly in the federal judiciary with lifetime appointments, are asking for trouble. I think a lot of the pressure.
So where was that 2 years ago? Where was that in 2019? This idea that we're asking for trouble when we go outside of our land. Casey has been the law of the land since, what is it? Casey's been the law of the land since 92. Roe v. Wade, 50 years. And he's talking about in this piece. He was talking about the landmark ruling that was about libel. 1964, New York Times versus Sullivan ruling made it harder for public officials to win libel lawsuits. By the way, Donald Trump was railing against the libel laws. Let's not forget, right? That was a Donald Trump meme, that there's something wrong with our libel laws. We need to do something about the libel laws so it's easier to sue. So hypocrisy knows no bounds with Clarence Thomas. That's why I've always felt like he was, that he was not a good justice. Let's put it that way. Not someone who I would listen to. I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about a more important ruling that just happened that he should be more concerned with. But I want to get to Breyer on Fareed Zakaria yesterday, talking his concerns about, in his view of the court. He's not retiring, by the way. Breyer must retire, but he's not retiring.
Start with your central premise, which is that the Supreme Court has a surprising amount of authority, is in many ways seen as a kind of pivotal player in American politics, despite the fact that it has no power. As Alexander Hamilton said, you quote him, don't worry about the Supreme Court. It has neither the power of the purse nor the sword. So What gives the court its authority?
Ultimately, it's that people in the United States, 331 million of them, 330 million are not lawyers. But ultimately, those people have decided that they want to live together. Every race, every religion, every point of view imaginable. And they have decided they want to live in one country, together, under law. That's an amazing thing in the history of the human race. And this document, the Constitution of the United States, is really the basic law that they have decided will hold them together. And the Supreme Court does typically have the final word as to the meaning of the words in this document.
So it wasn't always as easy as this. And you point, for example,
No, it wasn't.
You point to the decision in 1829, I think. The case was basically Georgia discovered that there was, state of Georgia discovered there was gold and land that was Cherokee Indian land. It had been given to the Cherokees by treaty. Georgia takes it. The Cherokees take Georgia to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules in favor of the Cherokee Indians. And then what happens?
Well, that's the case where even though John Marshall, the Chief Justice, and the others decided that northern Georgia belongs to the Cherokee Indians, the president, Andrew Jackson, supposedly said John Marshall, the Chief Justice, made his decision, now let him enforce it. And he sent troops, the president, to northern Georgia to enforce the decision, no, rather to kick out the Indians. And they marched along the Trail of Tears, many dying, to Oklahoma, where their descendants live to this day. So, it took a while, and there have been some terrible decisions of the Supreme Court. Dred Scott, terrible. Plessy v. Ferguson, that started segregation in the South, terrible. But there also have been some high points. Brown versus Board of Education. There must be integration. Legal segregation is great.
But you point out, Justice Breyer, your section on Brown is also fascinating. Brown v. Board of Education, saying that separate but equal is not okay. You know, you have to integrate the schools. Is 1954. Sorry. For 3 years, nothing happens. Nobody observes nobody follows it. And then in 57, a federal judge tells Arkansas that it has to admit 9 black kids into an all-white school. Tell that story of how close a call it was, because even then people didn't want Eisenhower to try to enforce this decision.
Well, it was a great decision of President Eisenhower that he would send 1,000 paratroopers, 101st Airborne, from Fort Bragg to take those children in the school. But they couldn't stay forever. And when they left, the authorities in Little Rock tried to end integration and go back to segregation, and the Supreme Court said no. All 9 justices said you must integrate. Now, well, those are 9 people. Those are 9 people. There could have been 900 judges. And there were a lot of people in the South who didn't want to. And so what I think happened is that was the era of Martin Luther King. That was the era of the Freedom Riders. That was the era when the North, the entire country, woke up to the injustice of segregation. And they wouldn't have gotten anywhere, the judges, if it had not been for all the people who aren't judges to begin to decide to bring justice to the South. No more legal segregation. And that means not just the decisions you like, but also decisions you don't like. What? Like Bush v. Gore. I dissented in Bush v. Gore, but I heard the Democratic leader in the Senate, Harry Reid, say the most remarkable thing about that opinion is people followed it without guns, riots, stones in the streets. And when people think too bad there weren't, I mean, I thought it was wrong. And when I hear them say, well, too bad there weren't a few riots, I say, hey, it's not too difficult to see what happens in countries and in places and in times when people don't follow a rule of law.
Justice Breyer, you were talking about Bush v. Gore, and I want to ask you a question about it in the context of your central argument. Your central argument, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we shouldn't think of judges as political in the way we do. Yes, they have differences, but those differences are not partisan political. They are jurisprudential. They are based on how people see the Constitution and law and things like the original intent of those laws. So when you look at Bush v. Gore, this is the case that I think changed many people's view about that, because the Constitution is pretty clear that the states get to decide who their electors are. In fact, that's what Republicans are now using as a way to allow states to do whatever they want with the electors, almost, in some cases, no matter what happened in the election. That states get to choose their electors. In Bush v. Gore, the conservatives, who normally take the position that states' rights are important and state authority must not be overridden by the federal government, those conservatives switched. And they ended up saying, no, in this particular case, we, the Supreme Court, we, the federal government, have authority that trumps the state. And to a lot of people, it looked like justices like Justice Scalia were completely reversing their long-held jurisprudential view to achieve a political outcome they wanted, the election of George W. Bush. Didn't that damage the court's legitimacy more than anything I can imagine?
I can imagine worse things. What about Plessy and Ferguson? What about separate but equal? But go back to the point. It would take me a while to convince you, more time than we have. But the Constitution says that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct the electors who will vote for the president. And the majority of 5 thought that the lower courts in Florida had not done what the legislature directed. I didn't agree with that one little bit. But the people who were in dissent, and there were 4, 2 were appointed by Republican presidents, and 2 were appointed by Democratic presidents. So some cases come out in ways the political party, one or the other, might favor, and some do not. Those differences of judicial philosophy, you pay more attention, complete attention, as Justice Scalia liked to do, to the text. Or do you also bring in, as I might like to do, consequences and purposes and values? The word liberty in the Constitution does not define itself. So there are many jurisprudential differences, and it isn't totally jurisprudential. But it isn't really right to say that it's political in the ordinary sense of politics.
So this whole thing about judicial philosophy and versus political philosophy is a canard. It's a smokescreen. This is something that is, this is sort of gaslighting to some extent. Amy Coney Barrett comes up with the same statement with respect to, we're not doing this because we're political hacks. We're doing this because this is our view of the law and our interpretation of the Constitution. My job as a judge on the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution. This is my view of what the Constitution says and how it should be implemented. But, it's not political. Bull. It doesn't have to be political. Your view that you don't have to be a political hack. Although, like I said, Kavanaugh is definitely a political hack. This guy has been a political activist on the right for years. Roberts was in, I believe, Ronald Reagan's administration as a low-level judge or whatnot. So these are political hacks. There's just no question. I think Thomas was part of EEOC. He was a political hack for years, working as a Republican appointee. So they're not non-political people. And also Amy Coney Barrett was talking about, and as did Thomas, there's a lot of similarity in what they're saying. We don't look for the decisions that we may want, we may like. The credibility, I'm beginning to believe more and more that what all 3 of these judges are doing is they're very concerned about the credibility of the court. Not so much that they care about it, but because it may because they know that the legislature and the people ultimately have control over the court, and that the court has no power at all. As they've said, they have neither the purse nor the sword, which is, it's something that's easily forgotten, that the only reason why we tolerate this is because we've chosen to tolerate it. People could make a decision tomorrow and decide, a Biden or Trump could have at any point in time said, just like Andrew Johnson or Jackson. Was it Johnson? I can't remember. But they could have at any point in time go, he made his decision, now let him enforce it. But as I said with regard to Amy Coney Barrett, the process is political. And there's this idea in the legal circles about the so-called gaining, rules of evidence, and talking about the this doctrine of evidence. If you obtain evidence illegally and you win a case based on that illegal obtaining of evidence, the whole case can be thrown out, or needs to be thrown out, because the entire case is tainted because of you broke the law in the very beginning. It's the fruit from the poison tree or something like that. I can't remember the term. I had it written down, but I can't find it anymore. But it's the same thing, except switch out politics. Switch out breaking the law with breaking political a political process, an apolitical process. Once that becomes politicized, then everything that comes out of that is now tainted, right? So when Mitch McConnell decides to, and the Republicans decide to vote against the blue chip process, which is how you're supposed to get judges. You go to the two senators from those states, and you get their suggestions as a part of that process for judges. When you change the filibuster, because you don't want the other side to be able to stop you from loading up the court with your justices. When you make an announcement and say, if I get the leadership once in the Senate once again, I'm not going to allow Biden to have put any more judges on it. That's now political. So you've created what was once all of these rules and norms that were apolitical. You've now made them political. And once they've become political, everything that comes out of those decisions, all the justices that come through because of those decisions, are now tainted. Now the entire thing is political. So the idea that you can have these judges go around and say, listen, we're not political. No, our decisions are based strictly on our view of the law. It's too late at that point in time. It's too late. You are now in a political process, because the very beginning of this process, the things that were put in, the safeguards that were put in to make this apolitical have been removed, and it's now a very political process. So, we don't have to listen to that anymore. And just like it would be no different at all than Biden going in and packing the court as Roosevelt did. It would be not good because it would make it a political exercise, but you've already ruined the whole political process. But I want to get to this. There's so much I wanted to talk about with this, but time is ticking by. And I've got to get to the census because that's important. But I have to get to this thing because it was it really stood out to me in terms of both Barrett, Thomas, and what Breyer said with respect, again, to this whole idea of we're not doing this politically. This is all about our judicial view. And that's how Fareed Zakaria ended it. But in my view, there's an even bigger example, not Bush v. Gore, but something much more recent that just happened very recently that I'm not surprised, but Anybody who wanted to sit around and talk about the consequences of the court's actions when they take on when they do something that or make a decision that has ramifications down the line. Remember, Amy Coney Barrett didn't chastise, but she made a statement that, listen, I'm an originalist textualist. I look at the text, just like Breyer was saying, Scalia, Thomas, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch. I look at the text, and what the justice, what the legislature that and the court that wrote that text and wrote that law, what they meant and what they thought. I look at that. Whereas, as Barrett says, Breyer, and I assume he would also agree that Sotomayor and Kagan all also would agree that they're pragmatists, right? And I said this on the last podcast that, she almost looks down on that idea. That's my inference. I don't know, but she certainly doesn't believe in that and doesn't follow it. They're pragmatists, right? And as Breyer said, we look at at today and what the impact of it would be today to make such a ruling. Like, Thomas is talking about, let's undo Sullivan, let's undo, all the wrongly decided court cases that we feel today, in our view, is not decided. Let's start dismantling everything. So Zakaria and Breyer brings up, Bush v. Gore, but what about McGirt versus Oklahoma? This thing, and this was just a ruling 2 years ago, but the ramifications are stunning. Just so that people are remembering, this is from, in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that about half of Oklahoma is Native American land. This is from July 20th, 2020. This is NPR. And it says the Supreme Court ruled Thursday that about half of the land in Oklahoma is within Native American reservation, a decision that will have major consequences for both past and future criminal and civil cases. This ties in directly with what Fareed and Breyer were talking about with respect to the Trail of Tears, right? Breyer talks about it in his book. They touch on this here. The Supreme Court rules that Georgia, the native people there, need to stay there. The president says, you enforce it. I'm not enforcing it. I'm going down there and I'm taking that gold. And that's where we get the famous Trail of Tears. They end up in Oklahoma, and then they're screwed over once again in Oklahoma. So, but however many years is that? I can't even remember when it was 18 something. The tribes move into Oklahoma and then are screwed over because the court refuses to recognize their sovereignty over their land that was then given to them, or because they were forced out of Georgia. They're then screwed over in Oklahoma. Now, 200 years later or so, Gorsuch joins with the liberals. And he writes the opinion, right? Sotomayor, Ginsburg was alive at the time, Kagan and Breyer join the majority. They make up the majority, 5-4 on this decision. And it's stunning because the textualists are now no longer textualists, right? They're now concerned about what the ramifications of this decision will be. Whereas the guys who are supposedly about the liberals, who are supposedly about the concern about what this will mean going forward, they're now textualists. They're now looking at the text and they're going, this is, I believe this is a quote from, Neil Gorsuch. So the court's decision hinged on the question of whether the Creek Reservation continued to exist after Oklahoma became a state. Today, we are asked whether the land these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for the purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. So Gorsuch is the only guy who's saying, I'm looking at the text. And the text says, this is native land. And Congress has not changed their opinion on this and has not done anything about this. All that has happened is that the state of Oklahoma has decided that they're not going to follow the law, and McGirt sues. I can't go into too much detail on this because there's so much and I'm running out of time. The ruling will have significant legal impacts for eastern Oklahoma. Much of Tulsa, the state's second largest city, is located in Muskogee Creek land. The Muskogee Creek Nation cheered the court's decision. The Supreme Court today kept the United States' sacred promise to the Muskogee Creek Nation of a protected reservation. Today's decision will allow the nation to honor our ancestors by maintaining our established sovereignty and territorial boundaries. In a dissenting opinion, Roberts, the Chief Justice, wrote the decision will undermine numerous convictions obtained by the state as well as the state's ability to prosecute serious crimes committed in the future and may destabilize the governance of the vast swaths of Oklahoma. I think, in my opinion, as well as the opinion of the liberal justices, is not just too bad, but they should have done something about this beforehand. They should have worked with one another over this. But, this is a red state. These are Republicans. This is a red state Republicans. And they're not about giving up land or doing anything. And this is a conservative court. So, of course, their thinking is, they're gonna adhere to precedent. They're gonna adhere to the way things have been going on for years. So, what are the ramifications of this decision? Now, here is where I would have thought, if you're somebody who's concerned about what the court can do, and he calls this, Thomas does, the most dangerous branch in his speech. When you're concerned about what the court's decisions could do, why are you talking about packing the court? Why are you talking about, all these other things? McGirt, look at this. This has come back to the court again because look at what happened with this decision. According to Oklahoma, this is from the WAPO. Kyle Willis hadn't seen Kimberly Graham in years, since the day she was sentenced to 107 years in prison after she drunkenly plowed her truck into a group of motorcyclists in Tulsa, killing 5 people, including his mother and stepfather. So it was a shock when he saw her in court hearing last month, tanned, dressed in a furry purple top and jeans, and laughing. A free woman. Graham, who is Native American, was let out of prison in April after a Supreme Court decision last year that found a large part of eastern Oklahoma is still Indian country. Despite a century of state and local prosecutions, the court ruled that crimes there were the province of federal and tribal courts. She's enjoying life as if nothing ever happened, said Willis. It's bizarre. It's crazy. The Supreme Court's landmark decision, McGirt versus Oklahoma, said prosecution of Native Americans for crimes in the expanded Indian country must be carried out in federal and tribal courts rather than by the state or local officials. It was celebrated across the country by Native Americans last July, who saw it as a historic affirmation of treaties signed with the U.S. in the 1800s. But in the last year since, the ruling has upended Oklahoma's criminal justice system, imperiled convictions in thousands of cases, sowed confusion for police and emergency responders, and led to the direct release of more than 50 criminals convicted on charges including second-degree murder and child abuse, state records show. And there may be wider impacts for the region, which covers 19 million acres of eastern Oklahoma, includes portion of the state's second-largest city, Tulsa, and is home to 1.8 million people. The local power plant is challenging an increase in its property taxes. The state is fending off a move by the federal government to strip its ability to regulate mines in Indian land. The state has also raised concerns about the potential of loss of tax revenue. The fallout has exacerbated long-standing tensions between Oklahoma's Republican governor Kevin Stilt, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and the leaders of 5 tribes involved. Stilt held a community forum on the issue this month that degenerated into raucous shouting, with attendees booing and chanting, "Treaties are the law of the land. We are living in a nightmare out here," Ryan Leonard, the Oklahoma governor's special counsel for Native American Affairs. It's complete dysfunctional chaos in the state of Oklahoma. Why, oh why, did Clarence Thomas not bring this up when he talked about the most dangerous branch? Why is he talking about abortion? Why is he talking about the media? Why is he talking about other nonsense? This just happened. This is going on right now. And the ramifications of this decision, now, I'm not making an opinion on the decision itself. That's not the point of this. So if people who are watching may be saying that I was against the decision or whatever, I would stand with the liberals on this. But we've got to see this whole notion of, it's my judicial philosophy. I don't, I'm not politics. I'm not about politics. It's judicial philosophy, as opposed to, and it's the text that's so important. We've got to look at the text. What does the text say? As opposed to, well, what are the ramifications of this? What does it mean if we do this, that, and the other thing? Both sides completely flipped on this whole thing. Gorsuch was the only guy who remained true to whatever his philosophy is. The most dangerous court. Complete chaos, according to Oklahoma. So, what have they done? What has Oklahoma done? They've gone back to the Supreme Court. This is August 2021. The precedent which ruled that much of eastern Oklahoma falls within Indian reservation is just over a year old. A couple of weeks ago, Oklahoma asked the Supreme Court to overrule it. Two things has happened between. First, as state officials and dissenting judges had predicted it would, the ruling disrupted Oklahoma's criminal justice system. Second, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was in the majority in the 5-4 decision, died and was replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. I didn't mark it down, but there was a quote I had found about Thomas, who, speaking about his predecessor, Thurgood Marshall, pulled a quote, and I cannot remember what the quote is. I'd have to find it, and I don't have time. But Thomas, Justice Marshall said, the only difference between now and then, when a decision was made that had turned out 5-4 and they overturned a decision that was made that was to the liberals' favor, the only thing between then and now is that we now have more conservatives on the court. That's the only thing that's changed since we made this decision. I can't remember what the decision was, but it was just before he stepped down. And I think Thurgood Marshall was sick, and he had said that I'm going to hold on to this seat until I possibly can, because I need to make sure that it goes to a Democrat, because I don't want some Republican to get it. And unfortunately, he was too sick and couldn't stay on. So George Bush won election, and we've had a conservative court ever since 5-4, and now 6-3. But he said, and then Thomas then repeats this admonition to the court over its non-respect for precedent. This is back in 91 during his hearings. He admonishes Congress and the court for overturning precedent that had just been set for political reasons because the court had changed. Now, the same thing is happening with McGirt. And again, the only thing that's changed is chaos in Oklahoma, but more importantly, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has now been replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. So if you are a non-political court, you should completely have dismissed this case. We've already decided it. Decisions are final. We're moving on. There's nothing to see here. That should have been completely rejected by the court. But it looks like the court is taking it up. Let's read from it. Oklahoma's bold request, like the challenges to Roe v. Wade and other abortion precedent that the court is set to hear in a case this fall, will test the court's commitment to stare decisis, which is the legal shorthand for respect for precedent, and Latin for to stand by things decided. The court has articulated standards for when it should overrule its decision in precedent about precedent, But no one thinks it's quite satisfactory. In a concurring opinion last year, for instance, Kavanaugh counted 7 factors that the court should consider in deciding whether to overrule constitutional precedent, but said he was unable to discern any consistent methodology or roadmap for how to analyze all of these factors. Give me a break. He's a please. Here it is. This is the quote. Thurgood Marshall took this view, and let me go back. Occasionally driven by cynicism or frustration or candor, dissenting judges have said that the most important factor is the most obvious one, whether the membership of the court has changed. Thurgood Marshall took this view in 91, dissent issued just hours before he announced his retirement. He accused the majority of overruling 2 recent 5-4 decisions on death penalty sentences based on nothing more than the arrival of new justices. Power, not reason, is the new currency of the court's decision making. Justice Marshall wrote in Payne versus Tennessee, adding that nothing else had changed since the court issued the earlier decisions in 87 and 89. Only the personnel of this court did. Clarence Thomas, who replaced Marshall and would go on to become a member of the court's most skeptical of stare decisis, addressed his predecessor's statement in his confirmation hearing, calling it a very important admonition. This is where Clarence Thomas bounces all over the place. You cannot simply because you have the votes begin to change rules, to change precedent. That's not the basis for doing it. Tell that to the Clarence Thomas of 2019 in this Reuters report that talked about, we need to go back and start redoing all of this precedent that's been around for years, that's been wrongly decided in our opinion. So this should have been rejected, basically. If it's about the credibility of the court and the credibility of its decisions and the decisions that it makes, it should immediately has dismissed and not taken up this case. But the fact that it did means there's a damn good chance. Although I don't see Roberts and I really don't see Kavanaugh, Gorsuch. I mean, what do I know? Roberts has shown himself to be all about trying to hold on to precedent and the view of the court. The same thing with and Gorsuch wrote the opinion on this. I cannot see them deciding to go with the conservatives, which Thomas would definitely still vote, to reverse this, even though he's made these statements. Look out for that decision. The decision will probably be next year in the summer, whether they're going to overturn McGirt. Listeners, watchers, look out for where Clarence Thomas, who has been all over the map talking about the importance of the court and its decision and its credibility. Look at where Amy Coney Barrett comes down on this. She hasn't decided. She didn't decide this before because she wasn't on the court. Is she going to look at precedent and say we need to put a break on this? The fact that they took this case tells you that they're willing to overturn precedent. It's a joke. It's a kabuki theater that they have respect for precedent. And Clarence Thomas is the biggest of them all.